Welcome to Off the Clock. Today we're going to talk about employers who are starting to enforce hybrid work situations, meaning that they would like their employees to be on site at least some days a week, maybe even 5, and employees who have been remote up until this point because of a health related condition, and how to manage that process now that we're in 2023 and the world has changed a little bit since those first accommodation requests were made.
Welcome to Off the Clock, the webcast of employment attorneys at Miller Johnson, where we discuss what is happening in the HR world and provide practical insight and advice.
So, folks that went home to work remote in March of 2020,
Lots of folks did.
well, most of us did, at least in Michigan, not everywhere, but at least in Michigan with shutdown orders. Can you believe that those folks are now in their 4th year of remote work? Folks that are still
Wow.
remote working.
Wow.
4th year,
Yeah.
3 complete years, right? 2 months into their 4th year of working remote. I don't think our listeners need a reminder of what's happened
Right.
between then and now, but let's just take a quick second to talk about how the world has evolved and why we're talking about the topic we're talking about today. Right. So first, everyone, unless we were essential workers, but
Right.
lots and lots of people, particularly office workers, started working remotely. And then things eased up, right? COVID with vaccines arrived and COVID rates dropped a little. There were waves, but at least there were large periods of time where they dropped and people started coming back into the office. But then some people decided they really liked remote, right?
Sure,
And the whole catchphrase at the time was flexibility.
Right.
Remember?
Absolutely.
Flexible.
I do remember. And I'll say, too, even before COVID, this idea had started to take hold, right? We started to see this idea of people wanting to be more flexible, maybe work remotely. We started to see some employers hire, quote unquote, remote employees who maybe live in a different location, et cetera, right?
Yep.
But in 2020, things accelerated really quickly with remote work.
Pedal to the metal.
Yes, exactly. Before 2020, it was sort of like, I don't know, there was a lot of uncertainty as to how it would work, whether
it felt very
could
progressive.
Work. Yes, exactly.
Didn't it? It felt very cutting edge.
Yes.
If organizations hired someone for just remote work from home.
That's exactly right.
And so just about everyone was home, and then employers wanted to be flexible, right? So there was a lot of employee flexibility, right, in terms of coming back to the office or not.
Yeah, right. And I saw some businesses in 2021 or even 2022 sort of have an initial attempt to encourage people to come back to work or maybe require employees to come back to work. And the pushback was so strong that some backed off and said, it's not worth it. It's not worth it.
One of those organizations very near and dear to our heart.
Yeah.
We're an organization like everyone else's.
Yeah.
And so we've been living this, right, along with our clients. So what's happening now? Why are we doing a COVID topic?
Right.
Now?
It's not really a COVID topic.
It was caused by COVID and the remote work requirements and then options. And now we're in 2023.
Right.
And what we are seeing across the board is employers, not all employers, but enough that it's become a pattern, right, in our client questions to us, employers deciding, no, we really do want you in the office, either a few days a week or 5 days a week. And when it's a few days a week, sometimes they pick the same days so the teams are together, right? And we're not just saying come in if you want or work remote if you want. We are seeing the losses we've experienced in terms of team building, training, mentoring, collaboration, etc.
Yes.
And things are safe enough now, right? The national health emergency has been declared over, so everyone come back.
Sure.
And as a result of those new policies, what are we seeing? I'm sure you know, right? And it's your favorite topic. It's requests for accommodations. Right? Employees who either cannot return to the workplace, the physical workplace, because of qualifying disabilities, or employees who do not want to come back to the workplace because of qualifying disabilities.
Sure.
Right?
Yep, absolutely.
And we're just talking about health issues here. There are some that moved
Yes.
during the epidemic,
Yes.
right? And now they're saying, I can't come back because I now live across the country.
I now live in Kansas.
That's
right?
not our topic of conversation.
Or they sold their car,
Because that's
for
a-
example. Right.
That's a quick answer.
Right.
This would be a 1-minute episode.
Yes. Right.
Can you say, well, then find another job? Yes, you can.
Yeah,
Right?
right.
Yes, of
Yeah.
course. Okay, so we're just talking about employees who either cannot or do not want to return to work, and they are telling HR it's because of
a health
condition.
Whether, and let me just say this out loud, whether a physical health condition or a mental health condition, because we're seeing a lot of both of those.
Yep. Absolutely, the increased awareness of mental health as health.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
Has increased. Something we're seeing now that's a little different than before also is long COVID. I've seen a number of requests
Yeah.
based
Me too.
on long COVID and the impacts of long COVID
Me too. Right.
preventing people, the employee explaining at least that long COVID prevents them from working in an in-person work environment. So that's a little different.
Right.
And employers
Interesting.
are struggling with it. So the fact that this is coming up now raises a few really interesting
It does.
points.
Right.
Some very specific to this timing, right? This moment in time. Some not. All right. So we're going to talk about the concept of the essential function of someone's job.
You're speaking my love language.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yes.
First, why don't we just outline the ADA, right? Like literally in 20 seconds or less. Do you think you can do it in 20 seconds or less?
I do.
Okay.
I do. The reasonable accommodation part of the ADA, right? That's what you want outlined in 20 seconds. I've already taken my 20 seconds.
I knew
Okay.
you couldn't do it.
The duty to provide a reasonable accommodation means an employer has to provide assistance that would help an employee perform their essential job functions, right? And so the ADA does not require an employer to remove essential job functions, only to provide assistance so that an employee can perform them.
Perfect. So let's think about then the concept of the essential job function, because
Right.
that is key, right? Like if I'm the first one into work, I may make the coffee, but that's not one of my essential job functions. If I can no longer
The
make the
classic
coffee,
example.
you
Yes,
should
the
accommodate
classic
that.
example.
Right.
Right.
Okay. So it really is important to distinguish what is an essential job function. Basically, what we cannot live without. We can live without you doing X, Y, or Z, but we just cannot live without you doing A, B, and C. A, B, and C are the essential job functions.
Sure.
Let's apply that concept of an essential job function to being in person at work, because that's not really like a duty, like produce this, make this, write this, right? Edit that. But just like attendance can be reliable and predictable, attendance can be an essential job function. Before COVID, it was really well settled that in-person work could be, under the right circumstances, an essential job function.
Sure.
Right?
Right.
What has happened since COVID? That's what everyone wants to know. That is my number one
Has that changed?
question. Has that changed since so many people have not been in person and the world has continued to turn? Right? We didn't
Sure.
all fall apart. We somehow managed to muddle through. Some people thrived, some people muddled, but we're all still here. And particularly now, as I said, some people are now entering their 4th year of working remotely, and we allowed it.
Right.
Can we now say in-person work is an essential function of your job? What do you
Right.
think about that?
Well, and great question. And I hear that a lot, by the way, from clients, right? They say pretty much exactly that. This person, we are asking everybody to come back to work, say 3 days a week. This individual is requesting not to. They've been working remotely since March of 2020. How can we really tell them no? How can we really say that it is still an essential function of their job to come work in person? And I certainly understand that concern. And that concern is valid. But I would also add, I think you can turn that on its head a bit too, because also the last 3+ years give us the opportunity to really look at and articulate what impact that has had,
Right.
right?
We no longer have to guess.
That's exactly
We no longer
right.
have to guess. Well,
That's
what would
exactly
happen if
right.
this person worked remotely? What would the impact be on the team and on
We
their
know.
productivity?
We know.
We know.
We know. And they're just because somebody has been minimally performing most of their job while working remotely does not mean that they are performing all of their essential job functions, right? There may be things that they haven't been doing or doing well. Their job may require them to receive or provide direct training to their coworkers, for example. And that may be something that has not been going well at all for the last 3 years. That's just an example. And I usually, when I talk to clients about this, the starting place for me is, well, tell me why.
Right.
Tell me why we are requiring everybody to come back. Talk to me about that first. Why is it, from an organizational standpoint, we've decided that's important? And there's usually some good information there, some good talking points there that we can grab onto. And then, of course, under the ADAs, we take things on an individual basis.
Right,
So then we
exactly.
drill down and we say, okay, from an organizational standpoint, we've decided that this in-person engagement is critically important because, right, and we fill in the blank. Now let's look at Sarah's job,
Right.
and let's talk about why her particular essential job functions might require her to perform in-person work. Or let's talk about maybe why they really don't.
Or not.
Or not. That's
Right?
exactly
And
right.
so even if the business has decided that working in person is important, at least some days during the week, when Sarah says, I can't work in person because of, let's just assume right now it's a qualifying disability. We're going to get to that. Don't worry. What happens when an
Right.
employee asks, what kind of documentation can you ask for, et cetera? We'll get to that. But let's just assume all of that has been done. Okay.
Yes.
We still have to look at your specific situation.
Absolutely.
Because
That's exactly right.
the reality is there's probably at least one position in every organization that might be able to be done remotely, even if as a whole, right, it's not going to do well for the business, for everyone to still be remote. And we have to look at not just the position, but your specific performance within your position, right? We need to look back at how you've done the past 3 years.
Sure.
Remote, right?
That's a good example.
And it could be,
Yeah.
we could have two people in the exact same position where one person could work remote and one person couldn't, based on their performance, right? Their productivity, their ability to stay engaged with their team members, even though they're home, their availability, right? A lot of work from home people, we have issues with not being available for unexplained reasons, certain times of the day.
Right.
So we have to do the organizational analysis, why it's important. But then when someone comes to you with an accommodation request, assuming, right, the documentation is there and that they qualify, we really have to look at that individual person
right.
in that individual role.
That's exactly right.
There's
And
no
don't-
shortcuts. Unfortunately, there's no shortcuts here.
And the advice I would give our listeners is don't assume that just because they have been working remotely since 2020,
Right.
that you can't require them to come back in person. And also don't assume the opposite, right?
Yes.
Take a time out, really think about both the organizational reasons for requiring employees to come back, and then really look carefully at what their job requires them to do, and see whether we do have an argument that they need to work in person in order to perform their essential job functions. The reality is, if this is a person that when they come and work in person, they are going to sit in their office by themselves all day, right? And are not required to engage with anyone all day long.
Right.
They come in, they do their work in their office, and they leave, and that's okay with us.
And their
It is-
performance has been good.
And their
while they've been
performance is
remote.
good. It's going to be hard for us
Yes.
to win that argument in a court. It's going to be hard for us to say, no, you have to, instead of doing those things from home, you have to drive to a building and sit in an office by yourself all day and do your job.
So let's talk about courts for a minute, because we are lawyers. after all. As I mentioned at the beginning, before COVID, it frankly wasn't that difficult, right, to win the argument that in-person work was an essential function, or that a request to work remote would have posed an undue hardship or that sort of thing. The argument is we can still absolutely take that position, as we said, we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes, but our clients should be more prepared to articulate
They have to be
everything
prepared to
we just
articulate.
talked
Yes,
about,
right.
and not just, we used to blow past that part of the conversation
Right.
fairly quickly
Yes.
because there was tons of law. The cases regarding COVID, reasonable accommodation work from home requests, have just not made their way through the entire legal process yet, right? So there is not a solid body of law, right, from the courts to say,
Right.
here's the new standard when someone has a remote work request after they've already been working remote for 3 years. We just don't have it.
I think that's right. But the legal framework is still the same.
It's the exact same.
It's the exact same.
Let's
It
just
doesn't
not
matter that
speed
it's
past
COVID.
that
That's
item
right.
when we're going through the analysis.
Yep.
Okay, so now can we do something really exciting?
Yeah. And more exciting than essential job functions even. I can hardly wait.
It's hard to believe.
I know. I'm ready.
But that can we ask people to come back even though they've been home for a while? That's the number one question.
Right?
The number two question is about documentation.
Yeah.
Right? There are things that, frankly, HR and supervisors are just unfamiliar with, like long COVID, right? They just don't know what to do when someone says, is that a real thing? Is that not? So, and this would go for any type of request, frankly, whatever anyone makes an accommodation request under the ADA, what does that look like? What are we entitled to ask for? What do we do with it when we get it? What's particularly relevant in this moment of time is folks that did request an accommodation and submit relevant documentation earlier on in COVID,
Yeah, good point.
and the world has changed.
The world
their
sure
health
has
condition
changed.
might not have changed, but the world relating to COVID has changed. And what I'm thinking about is when return to work first became an option later in 2020, and people who were high risk for a huge variety of reasons, high risk for serious complications if they contracted COVID, right, would request accommodations to continue to work from home. Right.
Sure.
So that is one that we are getting quite a bit, as well as I've seen a numerous long COVID requests based on attention span and easily being distracted, which has been my whole life. I've had long COVID my
So
whole
they're
life.
less distracted at home than they are at work?
When
'Cause
I'm
that's
saying
not
these
my
things, you're like,
experience.
Rebecca has had long COVID since the day I met her. But anyway,
Okay.
so one aspect of long COVID can be being easily distracted, and
Okay.
coworkers, phones ringing, et cetera, can be more distracting. So with that groundwork laid, why don't we just start again with the basic on documentation?
Yes.
Let's set COVID
Right.
aside. And when an employee says, I need an accommodation because of my health condition, which is X,
Sure.
what can an employer request
Right.
from them?
Right. And this goes back to the point that I just made a few minutes ago, which is the legal framework has not changed. Right.
Yep.
We're applying the same ADA legal framework to these issues as we would any other request for an accommodation. So good news for our listeners. I think a lot of them are familiar with that, with what that framework looks like, with what a reasonable accommodation process looks like. And absolutely, if an employee is requesting a reasonable accommodation, we can require medical documentation regarding whether or not they have an impairment that falls under the ADA, regarding whether they can perform their essential job functions, but also whether maybe other accommodations might be options, right? Because don't forget, for some of the things you've talked about, for example, remote work may not be the only solution.
Right.
There could be changes we could make to the work environment that would allow that employee to be able to work in person, for example, right?
Yep.
So, yes, so we can require the medical documentation. And if we believe circumstances have changed, which they certainly have, then yes, we could require updated documentation if what we have is from 2020 or 2021, et cetera.
And when we ask for documentation, this is something a lot of employers don't do, by the way, but we really like it. We just think it's much more effective. We help clients prepare, we have a template that we modify for specific purposes, but a very specific letter to the healthcare provider based on this employee's job description and essential functions, right?
Yeah.
It's not a general form or something that they sometimes scribble out on a doctor's. It's like a prescription pad. Sometimes I'm sure you've seen those.
Sure.
But it doesn't answer our specific questions, and then we have to go back again, and it just delays the whole thing. So we recommend asking very specific questions, attaching a job description, for instance, or at least a list of what the employee's essential job functions are. Yeah, and then just asking, can this employee do these things, with or without a reasonable accommodation? If they need an accommodation, and really drill down to the specifics, that can be a huge time saver. We have some examples just to run through. These are real life examples, that we've been hearing about.
Yes.
So, all right, take out the reading glasses.
How about that? Yeah, take out the glasses. Yes, how about an employee who's high risk for severe COVID? And by the way, I'm going to expand that to include other illnesses as well, because what we're seeing is employees have become aware that if they are immunocompromised, they're at risk not just for this thing called COVID, but also other viruses, et cetera, that are out there. So let's just say high risk.
I completely agree. Yes, and that they're not just newly aware that they're exposed. They've probably always been aware because they've been scared of contracting a virus that could cause serious illness or death. But they did not understand that remote work was an option.
Maybe, exactly.
I think that's the big, big twist here.
Okay. So employee is high risk, and vaccination is not an option. Doesn't want to risk contracting COVID or another illness while at work.
The recommendation is, of course, ask for documentation, right? Say, okay, I understand your concern. Here's a letter I'd like you to provide to your doctor. We'll see what the doctor says, And then we will take it from there. And let's just take it one step further. If the documentation says this person, because of medical condition X, cannot work within X feet of other people, and therefore should work remotely, the first question is, can you perhaps separate them in the office, from other people? And if you're doing that, what's the point of having them in the office? You need to think these things through.
Yeah.
And if not, if there really is no way for them to be in the office, according to the doctor, then you go through the reasonable accommodation analysis that we went through, and that particularized,
the essential job functions.
Yes, this is an essential job function for this particular person, and this particular job, can we accommodate it or not,
Yep.
And it is possible to say no in those situations, Okay. Next, I'm just pretending you're HR.
Okay.
By the way, an employee tells you that they have long COVID and are too fatigued to drive to work. Therefore, they need to work remote as a reasonable accommodation.
Right.
What do you think?
I think we do exactly the same thing. I think we require the medical documentation. This is a great example of one in which I would probably do a specific letter, because this is such a specific circumstance, and the information we need is really not amenable to a form, So I'd like to ask that doctor specific questions, see what we get back, and then if indeed the medical documentation supports the idea that they can't drive a car for more than a half an hour, so for example, then we would look at essential job functions and potential other accommodations, et cetera. Last one, third employee has long COVID and has trouble focusing or is easily distracted in the workplace. This is one that just personally I get confused about, because my home is so much more distracting than my workplace. But I understand that may not be true for everyone. So I guess in this circumstance, this employee's home is less distracting than the workplace
We've
might
definitely,
be.
you and I have talked about this a lot since COVID. We both have a similar situation, and we were both doing our version of seeking an accommodation to be in the office.
Yes, that's exactly because of the distraction.
But what
Anyway.
I've learned from talking
Everyone
to
has
clients
different
about this for over 3
experiences.
years
Yeah,
now
right.
is a lot of people apparently
have less
have
distracting
different
homes.
experiences at home, right? Have a different home environment, let's just say, where they can concentrate and focus. And so this employee is telling me this. So I've never known anyone with long COVID. I am concerned that maybe the person just doesn't want to come back in the office, just prefers being at home for various reasons. I'm skeptical.
Right.
But what am I going to do? I'm going to ask for the documentation. I'm going to write a specific letter with specific questions to the doctor. Right?
Follow the process. That's exactly.
I'm going to follow the process, and whatever skepticism I may have or not have is completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
Right. The process
it.
is exactly the same.
Got it.
Right.
Yep.
So what is the common denominator here for all of these examples?
The ADA
Just follow the process, right?
That's right.
Ask for the documentation. And a last example we could use, although you already talked about, which is really important, if there has already been an accommodation process and there's already been documentation, but it's several years old now,
Sure.
right? It is absolutely acceptable to ask for new documentation.
Yep.
Yep.
Agreed.
Okay. I think we've about done enough as much as we can with that topic, Sarah. But this really is a burning question. I'm
getting
for
lots of
a
phone
lot
calls
of
on it,
listeners.
so, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I think this was great. Very informative.
Thanks, Rebecca. Have a great day.
You too.
Okay.